My name is Aaron Hager. I'm an associate professor of weed science in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois. And our topic for conversation today is some of the considerations when planning to control weeds in forage crops. The objectives for the lecture today are threefold. Number one, we hope to be able to recognize why weed control is very, very important in forage crop production. Secondly, to understand the importance of knowing and understanding the life cycle of any particular weed that could be encountered in a forage production system. And then finally, identify some of the key factors that should be considered when selecting a weed management program in forage production. So first off we'll ask the very simple question, why is it that we should control weeds in forage crops? Now, there's many reasons why we should do this. Number one, for example, is if we control and manage the weed populations in forage crops, we can actually preserve and enhance both the quality and the quantity as well as the digestibility of the forage species. Many of the weeds that we contend with in forage crops can actually adversely impact all of these, the quality, the quantity, as well as the digestibility. We also control weeds to eliminate weed seed production and dispersal. Weeds that are actually allowed to grow and reach maturity in forage crops, the seed can then be harvested along with the forage crop. It can actually be fed through livestock, and many weed seeds remain viable through the digestive tract of animals. And these seeds could subsequently be spread and introduced into new areas through the dispersal of the manure from the animals. Of course, some weed species are actually quite toxic to livestock. There's quite a few different weed species that have various toxic elements that can adversely impact whether it be cattle, horses, sheep, etc. And then finally, we control weeds to preserve the forage crop yield potential. And that's a very, very central tenet in weed management. Really focusing on preserving the crop yield potential. The idea behind this, of course, is that each acre of land that we farm, whether this be in forage production, corn, soybean, sugar beets, etc., has only a finite amount of resources available to support plant growth. Of course, the elements that are very, very common to plant growth, water, nutrients, space, etc., all of these are needed by the forage crops. These are the same requirements, these are the same resources that weed species also need to complete their life cycles. So we manage or we control weeds so that more of these limited resources are available to the forage crop to be used in its growth and production. Now, not only do weeds adversely impact forage quality, there's also other ways through which weeds can be a nuisance in forage production. For example, as we illustrated earlier, some species, like poison hemlock, the plant in the photograph to the left on this slide, contains elements that are toxic to various livestock. The plant in the middle is eastern black nightshade. It also contains elements that are toxic to livestock. And then finally, the plant on the right, in the right photograph, is horse nettle. And you can see very closely, if you look at the stem, it's covered in very, very sharp spines on the stem, which could injure animals that accidentally graze on this particular species. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the toxic elements of various weed species, there's a very, very good guide that you can consult. It's called A Guide to Plant Poisoning of Animals in North America. And the information about this guide is represented here at the bottom of this slide. The weed species that we encounter in forage crop production actually have one of three possible life cycles: annuals, biennials, or perennials. Annuals are those species that complete their life cycle, and their life cycle would be from seed at the beginning of the year to seed production at the end of the year. So they complete their life cycle within one growing season. Biennials are those species that actually complete their life cycle over two complete growing seasons. And perennials are those species that theoretically could live indefinitely, more than 2 years. And it's very, very important to know the life cycle of any given weed species that you would encounter in a forage production system, because the life cycle is very, very important in determining how best to manage that particular species. So throughout the life cycle of a forage crop production system, we've outlined which types of weeds tend to be most commonly encountered during various stages. So for example, during the establishment stage of the forage, most of the weed species that we encounter would be annuals. During the actual production of the forage, say in years 2 through years 4 to 5, for example, many of the plant species, the weed species that you would encounter would actually exhibit either a biennial or a perennial life cycle. The annuals tend to decline in frequency. In a well-established forage crop, it can be very, very competitive against many annual weed species. And then finally, as the forage stand begins to decline, we can actually encounter all three life cycles: annuals, biennials, and perennials. The annual weed species are generally much easier to control than either biennial species or perennial species. If we're talking about trying to manage these various weed species life cycles with herbicides, many times if we're dealing with either biennial or perennial species, a post-applied herbicide is often what we need to try to effectively control not only the tissue of these species that's above ground, but we also need to control the below ground portions of the plant also. So in this graph, we're simply looking at the general representation of herbicide effectiveness for control of various biennial weed species. So on our y-axis, we have percent control from 0 up to 100, 100 of course being complete control of the species. And along our x-axis, we have the various stages of the life cycle of a biennial species. And we can see that generally speaking, if we're using a post-applied herbicide to control biennial species, they're most effective when that biennial plant is still as a seedling or rosette stage. During the second year of the life cycle of a biennial species, the plant exhibits what's called bolting, which is a very rapid elongation of the stem. And once the biennial species begins to bolt, the effectiveness of our post-applied herbicides declines very, very rapidly. On this slide, we're actually looking at the control of perennial weed species, again by post-applied herbicides. And identical to what we just looked at for biennial species, perennial species are most sensitive to post-applied herbicides during their seedling stage. And again, you can see a very rapid drop-off in terms of control level as the perennial plant species moves from a seedling to a vegetative stage. We begin to see improved performance of post-applied herbicide when that perennial species begins into the reproductive mode, or what's called the bud stage. And then also we can actually see some fairly good activity if we make an application during the early part of its flowering stage. As the plants mature again toward the end of the growing season, their level of control can actually decline again. But sometimes if we have a bit of regrowth, say we would mow off a perennial stand and we get a little bit of regrowth from these perennial plant species, we can begin to see a little bit of elevated control once again. There are several methods that we can effectively use to control weeds in various forage crops. For example, many cultural practices can be employed to give our forage crop species a competitive advantage against weeds. So perhaps things as simple as the planting date or the establishment date of the forage, the variety selection. Do we have an adequate level of soil fertility that would allow the forage crop to become quickly established? Rotational grazing is also a practice that could be used to effectively control some of our weed species in our forage crops. Mechanical methods for weed control would be things as, for example, such as frequent mowing. We could also use selective tillage during a renovation process to eliminate certain patches, let's say, of perennial weed species. And then herbicides are another option that farmers could employ in the establishment and growth of forage crops. We usually break down the herbicide classifications to those that are primarily applied to the soil, whether before planting, with mechanical incorporation, or after the forage has been seeded but before it emerges in a pre-emergence timing. And then also the foliar-applied products, those that are simply applied after both the forage and the weeds have emerged. The soil-applied herbicides that we use in forage crops most commonly are applied prior to seeding of the forage crop itself. These products are used primarily to control various annual weed species. And if we can adequately control the annual weed species during the seeding and establishment phase of the forage crop, we allow that forage to become established with minimal interference, minimal competition by other weed species for those limited amount of resources that the forage is trying to utilize. The foliar-applied herbicides are most commonly used in established forage stands. Now, the application timing of our foliar-applied herbicides is very, very important for successful weed control. Generally speaking, the smaller the annual weeds are, the better the control that we can achieve with a foliar-applied herbicide. And as we saw in a few slides previous to these, our timing of control for both biennial and perennial species with our post-applied herbicides is very important to achieve successful weed control. Our timing is also important to try to avoid any particular types of crop injury and any deleterious effects that we may have on animals that are either grazing in the area or that could be fed the forages should they be harvested soon after a herbicide has been applied. It's always very, very important to check each respective herbicide label for a variety of pieces of information. For example, the herbicide would tell you the type of forage that this particular product could be used for. For example, there are certain herbicides that are used only in grass forages. There are others that we would use only in legume forages, and then we would have to select some if we do have mixed stands that contain both grass and legumes. It's very difficult to selectively control grass weeds in a grass forage crop, and likewise it can also be a bit of a challenge to find a herbicide that would selectively control broadleaf weeds in legume forages. We also need to check the label to see whether or not the product can be used in seedling stands, or perhaps it's only labeled for use in established stands. Another very important piece of information contained on the herbicide label would be any required time between application and either grazing or harvesting of the forage. Now, these intervals can and oftentimes do vary depending on what the intended use of the forage would be. Sometimes labels would indicate that we have a certain number of days between application before grazing can occur, and other times there'll be intervals between when the application is made and when the forage could be harvested. And it's always good also to check to see if there's any specific warnings for dairy cattle. For example, a label may indicate that lactating animals must be removed from the area prior to when the application is to be made. Now, there are many factors that really affect the performance of herbicides. For example, the activity of our soil-applied herbicides is primarily governed by many factors associated with the soil itself. For example, the texture of the soil, the organic matter content. Certainly soil moisture is a very, very important and critical element for effective use of soil-applied herbicides. With the foliar-applied herbicides, generally speaking, the activity of these products is more influenced by the current and future environmental conditions around when the application is made. And again, as we stressed earlier, the performance is generally better when applications are made to smaller weeds. Now, with the foliar-applied materials, of course, we have to contact the leaf foliage of our target weed species. So check the label and pay careful attention to recommendations related to the application of the product in terms of its rate that should be applied, and if there are any particular spray additives that should be included during the application. When we select a weed management program in forage, the goal really should be to ensure a well-established and vigorously growing forage crop. If we can achieve that by achieving good weed management early on in the growth and selection of the forage crop, it can become very, very competitive with weeds and many times reduce the need for additional weed management or weed control practices during its life cycle. Any sort of an integrated weed management program that actually utilizes and incorporates various tools and tactics into managing weeds is a very sound way to approach weed management in forages. Another way to state that is there's really no one-size-fits-all program with respect to managing weeds in our various forages crops. Herbicides can be important tools for successful establishment and management of forage crops, but there's also a lot of non-chemical tactics that are also very, very important to help ensure good forage production. So our take-home messages from this particular lecture, of course, number one is really the fact that effective weed control helps us maximize forage production and the quality of forage that we'll harvest. There's also many other advantages, of course, that can be realized through good weed management, such as a reduction in the weed seed that's either returned to the soil or potentially introduced in new areas. A well-planned and integrated program approach is, generally speaking, a much more consistent approach to managing weeds than simply a reactionary program once weed challenges become well established in the forages. So be sure to consider all your options for effective weed management in any particular forage scenario that you might encounter.